So now I'm going to introduce Martin Seager as a consultant clinical psychologist, and he's going to talk to us more about this narrative, I believe. Martin.
Thank you very much, Mike, and hello everybody. And I echo a lot of what Naomi said, pretty much everything there and in the comments. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about. I'm going to focus on attitudes to men and trying to get a handle on psychologically where they're coming from and scientifically measure them so we can do something about it in practical and policy terms. So my background is in science, mental health and therapy. So over the last 10 years, myself and colleagues, including Naomi, have made up for lost time doing research, gathering evidence, trying to influence thinking and practice in relation to men and boys. It's been an uphill struggle. We've now achieved a section of the British Psychological Society for men, for male psychology, but that incurred resistance. I mean, a third of people who were psychologists voted against that. So there's a kind of attitudinal bias even within psychologists. In fact, only 20% of psychologists are men. And in fact, following our work on male psychology, we've now got the first module in the UK. I think it might be one of the first in the world, male psychology module in the University of Sunderland. So that's great that we've got that, but it should be shocking in a way that it's the first in 2021. It's the first time that students of psychology are going to be taught about men's issues from the horse's mouth, because obviously we hear about men's issues from a feminist lens, quite rightly. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that because we need as many different lenses and theories as possible. Science is about gathering theories and data and then balancing them, but we're not getting any directly male-focused therapy to psychology trainees. So we're trying to correct that. So you just inviting me to speak today is another milestone for me in this whole process that I've been personally at for about 14 years now. So we're frequently telling boys to open up these days as if that's the solution, you know, they're just not opening up, they're being macho. But actually, the reality is we're not listening to boys or men. I think that came out of Naomi's talk. In fact, the actions and policies of society in the West are still telling boys and men that their gender doesn't really have problems, you know, women are catching up, you're still ahead. So the message to boys and men is that basically society is, it's a man's world, it's a patriarchy. So it's a man's world, women are catching up. So your male gender doesn't have problems. And also, in fact, what boys and men are being told is their gender is a problem. So not, you know, that's a very important message, which is implicitly and explicitly coming across. So those of us in this area think we've got to be scientific about this, because otherwise you're going to be seen just as an ideological group. I mean, often when you raise men's issues, you're seen as an ideologist, some kind of activist, some kind of sort of not normal person, which is sad. But so we've tried to come up with a scientific theory of how the bias gets conceptualized, and we're calling it gamma bias. So gamma bias is a combination of alpha and beta bias. In gender studies, alpha bias is when you magnify gender differences, you know, say girls can't do this or boys can't do that. And beta bias is when you deny or minimize gender differences, like saying there's no differences between men and girls and boys. They're all the same. Just treat them the same, and everything will be the same. Now, gamma bias is our combining those two, alpha and beta. So what we're saying is that bias occurs in society by magnifying some differences and minimizing others at the same time. That's where our theory is original. We're saying that we're magnifying some differences between boys and girls, but we're minimizing others, and therefore we're getting this total distortion effect. Now, the best way of illustrating gamma bias, but it's to use the gender distortion matrix, which is just basically 4 areas where bias can occur. So what I'm basically doing is just trying to illustrate that there are 4 areas of bias. One is where 4 areas of behavior. One is where you do good things. One is where you do bad things. Another one is where you receive good things. Another one is where you receive bad things. So when you're doing good, we're calling that celebration. When you're doing bad, we're calling that perpetration. when you're receiving good, we're calling that privilege. And when you're receiving harm, we're calling that victimhood. So basically, you've got perpetration, celebration, privilege, and victimhood. Those are 4 areas where you can be biased. Okay, so that's basically the idea behind the theory. What we're now attempting to do is to measure that. So I'm currently undertaking research with colleagues from USA and other British colleagues into this. So we've published the theory, but obviously we're prepared to test it. It's not ideological. This is an attempt to kind of understand what's going on with our perceptions of men and boys. So it fits the anecdotal evidence of what's going on in society. We want to do more than that. We're doing experimental empirical studies, which are ongoing as we speak. But the basic idea behind gamma bias is that when men do something really good, like they rescue someone from a burning building or they die in a war, we don't make that a gender issue. We never say masculinity is great. This is a good thing. We never make gender the issue. But as soon as men do something bad, like rape, murder, gender becomes the issue. So in other words, if you're making gender the issue only selectively when a bad thing is done, you're distorting the narrative so that people begin to believe men and boys are just bad. And obviously, the reality is that the vast majority of men are doing good things, and the ones who are doing bad things are the minority. Therefore, you're creating a massive distortion around a small number of men being seen as representative of a large gender demographic. We also, as Naomi said, we're getting concepts such as hegemonic masculinity, patriarchal masculinity, toxic masculinity. They've sort of become mainstream, and they're not really questioned. No one's done a study saying we treated 100 men as if they were toxic and 100 as if they were nice and compared the outcome. No one's done that study yet, except that when you do look at therapy outcomes, all people respond to therapies which treat them with empathy. As Naomi was said, or even the most damaged men, you can explain from their history. It doesn't mean they shouldn't be locked up, but what it does mean is that there's a reason why they're bad. It's not because they're men, it's because they've been abused, traumatized. But we're now at a cultural low point where even a single damaged psychopathic man, such as the killer of Sarah Everard, and previously there was a girl called India Chipchase, who was raped and murdered in 2016, leads to a social reaction of, we've all got to go and teach all boys to respect girls. All boys are like this, could be if we don't teach them not to be. So we've got this moral panic around the whole gender. And let's take the example of the father of the girl who was murdered in 2016, India Chipchase's father. He famously said, I remember on the radio, I will never walk my daughter down the aisle. And that's very sad, and we're all kind of gutted by that. And yet that man was not seen as a typical man. The murderer of his daughter was. In other words, what I'm saying is we don't go around schools telling boys, when you grow up, you'll be a father of a daughter and you'll want to walk her down the aisle. We're going around to schools saying, you don't want to become a psychopathic murderer, so you must show more respect. So what we're doing is we're distorting the narrative around what we're teaching boys based on the statistical sample of tiny minority. And we all know as scientists that statistics means you can't generalize from a tiny proportion of a sample. One must generalize from the majority of the sample. We've recently just had the D-Day. We're celebrating the heroism of the soldiers who all died on Gold Beach, and there's a memorial's gone up there. And there were over 22,000 men who died, but there were 2 women in that, in that list, which rightly so, they were recognized too. But rather than focusing on the sacrifice of the 99.99% of men, we became gender neutral. So we said, we're remembering the men and women of D-Day. There were only 2 and over 22,000. But when it comes to rape and murder, you've got much larger numbers of women who are committing sexual assaults or murder or violence, domestic violence. But we never include the women. We never say the men and women who do rape. We say the men who rape. So even when you've got a large minority of women doing something bad, the narrative is about the men. When we have a tiny minority of women doing something good, the narrative is gender neutral. So basically, scientifically, what we're doing as a society, this is happening in America too, Western Europe, we're basically only highlighting the male gender when something bad happens. So therefore, we're reinforcing this assumption that men must be bad. And of course, some are, for reasons Naomi explained. But men are mainly protective. I mean, men have evolved to protect women and children. And our society's attitudes to women and children still reflect that. So when we hear news reports of people being damaged, say refugees, they always say, oh, 300 people were killed, including 20 women and children. We highlight the women and children because as a society, we've evolved to protect women and children for evolutionary reasons. But what's happening is that we're including women in good publicity, even when they're a tiny minority, and excluding them from bad publicity, even when they're a sizable minority, or sometimes 50-50. So we're distorting the narrative. And in the sense, so boys these days are growing up, they're being told that they're more likely to be a potential criminal than a good father, than a good citizen, a good soldier, a good community member. And domestic violence is a perfect example. I know Mark Brooks, who's listening in, has done a lot on this, and but there's a lot of research out there that show that the lowest figure you can put on male victims of domestic violence is 33%. It's probably higher. Men don't report it as much. Some studies come up with 50-50, but whatever the figures exactly, most definitely men are a significant a number of domestic violence victims, and yet the narrative excludes them. So suddenly we're not gender neutral. When it comes to something where men are the victims, we're very specifically excluding men. So we've got other areas like suicide, homelessness, educational performance, life expectancy itself, deaths at work, military and civilian, prison sentencing, parental access to children. All these are areas where men are disadvantaged, and yet there is no there's a deafening silence. Also, diversity is our current mantra, but all identities now are celebrated except being men. We celebrate every single identity except being a man. In fact, current attitudes towards being men mean you're not only expected not to be proud of being a man, you're encouraged to be ashamed of it. So we're encouraging identity and diversity, but if you're a man, forget it. We're simply ignoring science, and we're pursuing an ideological position that something wrong with being masculine, with being male, that needs fixing. This has even crept into psychology training. In America and Britain, we're now teaching therapists to think that if you're dealing with men, you've got to address their power, even though a lot of men are powerless. Most men are powerless, only a tiny elite number of men are powerful. So where do these attitudes come from? I'll finish because I know we haven't got much time, but basically the attitudes are coming from two things that are interacting. The first thing is that we've always evolved to protect women and children. And so men have always been sent to war. Men have always done the jobs which require risk and the risk of death. And that might be a good thing. But if it is a difference, we need to respect it as a difference rather than pretending everything's equal and the same. But at the same time, in our bid for equality, we're ignoring all those things where there are differences. So firstly, we still want to protect women and children. That's hardwired, I think, into our species. So that fuels the idea that men are somehow, they're going to evoke less sympathy because we're protecting the women and children. The men are kind of expected to do the protection. So therefore, we're not so sympathetic if a man is homeless, if a man dies. We're not quite so protective because to our species as a whole and our society, we need to look after women and children to make sure the population continues, and that, you know, so there's an evolutionary basis to that. It's not all prejudice, but some of it is a kind of post-feminist narrative that's kind of crept into academia, politics, and the media. Kind of assumes women are still the second sex and they still need to catch up. So there's kind of a patriarchy where everything's in favor of boys. But if you look at all this evidence we've all been talking about, it's not quite clear what that means. I mean, where is a young man got power these days? I don't get that. But at the same time, the science is telling us that the suicide levels, the homelessness levels, the life expectancy levels, the risks are not favoring boys. Education is not favoring boys. So as a society, we've got a kind of a cognitive dissonance, I guess, between these facts and what we want. So really, just to sum up, I mean, obviously, the question is, what do we do about all this? Obviously, I'm talking to politicians here, so policy is a key thing, but policy can only be informed by data, by science. So we need a sort of good relationship between policy makers and scientists to kind of get all the evidence together and change policy. But obviously things we've been saying, like getting more male role models into schools or into communities, just teaching psychologists more about this stuff would be useful. I mean, the British Psychological Society, we're working on trying to get curriculum changed. We've got a male psychology module now in Sunderland. So it's going to be chipping away. But this whole narrative, we need a scientific kind of explanation for why it's so distorted. And so gamma bias is our way of trying to explain it systematically. And we will continually research that and try to give that evidence to policymakers so that we can gradually change attitudes. But obviously attitudes, once they set in, are hard to shift and they become self-fulfilling. As Naomi said, you know, perception is, once you have a perception, you tend to see the things that reinforce it and you're blind to the things that would go against it. So it takes time. And often when you talk about this stuff, you are met with resistance. And whenever I've talked about this, even amongst psychologists who are scientists, you know, I get quite emotionally resisted in even claiming some of these things are just facts. They're not even needing research. They're figures based on actual, you know, ONS statistics and things like that. So I will leave it there, but obviously I hope that gives you a flavor of how we're trying to be scientific about this, because the danger is, because of the very bias we're talking about, you can be perceived as a kind of raving lunatic for going on about men's issues. And obviously, as someone who spent my life helping women, mainly because they're the most, in the NHS, most of the clients are women, and I've spent my whole life helping women, but they come with men, and we all should be in this together. And if we don't get gender right for men and women, we're going to damage our children. So thank you anyway.